Of course, there's no reason to create legislation to deal with what happened in Christchurch of this nature, because all you need to do is either criminalise the uploading of a terror event and then prosecute the person who does so, or allow Facebook and other social media companies to create a notification button, which if you misuse it, you end up with a criminal offence. That would have solved the problem without creating this entire system of censorship. Now, I argued at the time that this terror legislation would be used and turned around against ordinary citizens who disagree with the political leadership. Now, setting aside that the department couldn't even manage to spell its own name correctly, they spelled extremism wrong, should we be worried about this? Because don't forget, Daniel Andrews brought out the tanks on people who were protesting in Victoria under the similar sort of terror legislation.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Alexandra, in the sense that once legislation is passed for whatever reason, and I think your arguments are very sound, that legislation wasn't, or this particular form of legislation wasn't necessary. And goodness me, it involves an awful lot of person hours, you know, going through all of this work. You just sort of think of the phenomenal waste of time. But here it was meant to counter violent extremism, and before you know it, it's being used for people who have very legitimate debate, and in point of fact, many of these posts were absolutely correct. But the value of this is to actually have a debate. So I think that the legislation is a big mistake. Governments always overreach. You know that once it's there and it's meant to be used for something, they'll want to use it for something else. And
And this was a very popular piece of legislation produced by the Liberals and supported by everyone. I mean, they were very keen to get their hands on social media censorship. Now, you touched on before that the excuse given was the undermining of public confidence in the health campaign, particularly for COVID vaccination. Now, obviously, the health department at the time forgot that confidence must be earned, not forced with a dictatorial fist. But how does that account for the censorship memes such as Dan Andrews and the image of him wearing a mask? Surely this is a Beijing level of censorship in which we saw him getting rid of anything that suggested he was like Winnie the Pooh. This is what communists do.
Yes, well, it's kind of interesting because, of course, the Department of Home Affairs is a federal government ministry, and so it would have been under the supervision of a federal, that is a coalition minister. So while there did seem to be an enormous amount of sort of coziness around the sort of national cabinet table, I suspect that I personally didn't actually see that. That wasn't one of the posts that I saw that the whistleblower showed me about. But I imagine what I can understand, or the logic seemed to be anything that criticised masks or mask mandates, anything that criticised lockdowns, anything that criticised vaccines or vaccine mandates. These seem to be the touchstones. So I think it was probably on that basis that it was undermining confidence in the efficacy or the necessity of a mask mandate that it was done. But I don't know, that's my speculation.
Well, Rebecca, let me ask you about that. Isn't the premise wrong to start with? What right does the government have to moderate public confidence?
Absolutely. Oh, I totally agree with you. I'm speculating about why someone who was working for a federal Liberal or coalition government was bringing down posts about Dan Andrews. And I think the reason there was because of the mask was the sort of the common link between those two things, rather than when they were from different political parties. But absolutely, the government, this is what was so frightening about the level of censorship that went on for the last 3 years, and which looks like it will go on, is still going on in Australia. The contract for this censorship program, I think, ends at the end of this financial year. So for all we know, posts are still being pulled down.